Hey listeners, it's Olivia here. Just a heads up that the following episode was recorded live at the International Medieval Congress at the University of Leeds in July 2024. Charlie and Rachel recently did an episode with our guest Laura on how to write your first monograph, but we had so much interest on the topic from you guys that we decided we'd take the show on the road and do a live episode on what's involved in publishing your first monograph. Needless to say, I have no experience in this, but fear not, we have some very experienced colleagues in this episode to give you a whole variety of perspectives. We're also very pleased that this episode was made possible by funding from the Institute of English Studies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. The Institute of English Studies is an internationally renowned research centre and the UK's hub for the field of English studies. Specialising in the history of the book, manuscript and print studies, textual scholarship, digital editing, and new critical approaches to literary history, the Institute offers postgraduate programs, summer schools, and short courses from medieval paleography to early modern bookbinding and digital humanities. They also host major collaborative research projects, provide research training in book history and paleography, and facilitate new and emerging research in all areas of English studies. To find out more, or to apply for a summer school, master's, or doctoral program in the history of the book, search Institute of English Studies, University of London, or go to ies.sas.ac.uk. That's ies.sas.ac.uk.
Keen and eager early career scholars and such, I think. Hopefully if you're following, and others. Hopefully if you're following on the Zoom you can hear this. If it's coming out muffled, then write a message in the chat box and I'll have a look in a minute and deal with that. So welcome to the session, whose number I can't remember, but the session is called From Dissertation to Book, How to Plan and Write Your First Academic Monograph. I'm Charlie Rosier, and everyone else will be introduced in a minute by Olivia, but I'm talking to you, so it's only fair that I should tell you who I am. There's a special thing to note about this session, which is that basically all of us contribute to a podcast that you can find on Spotify and on the screen behind us called the Early Career Researcher Podcast. And this session of the Leeds conference is going to be recorded as an episode for that podcast, as our first kind of live recording. Later on in the Q&A session, if you would like to ask us a question, but you wouldn't like it to be included in that podcast, then tell us at the end and we will edit it out for you. Absolutely no problem. So if you want to ask a question but you don't want it to be put out there for the rest of the world, then just tell us and we're fine. So I wanted to just say a little bit about that and where it comes from. So this session is related to our podcasting escapades. In autumn 2023, Rachael, Olivia and I started basically just using podcasts as a way to reflect on the challenges that early career researchers have in their working lives. So we've discussed things like academic careers, PhD funding, writing monographs, how to prepare for conferences, things like that. As you can see behind us, there are 12 episodes so far. And also we reflect on our lives as academics. And probably our most popular podcast episode to date has been the episode we did on having children in academia and how that affects your academic career. And Laura was on that and was the star of the show, definitely. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then look us up. It's completely free to listen to on Spotify. We publish about every 2 weeks, but our academic lives do get in the way, so sometimes we're not quite as regular as that. We have a Twitter, which is just ECR Podcasters. We have a Blue Sky, which is the same, and we have an email, which is ecrpodcasters@gmail.com, if you have anything that you'd like to talk to us about. After that, we're going to hand over to Olivia, who's in charge.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. I realised on the session everybody was expecting Charlie to chair, but Charlie has experience of the publishing industry, and so we felt, and of writing a monograph, and so we felt very strongly that he should be on the panel. And my name's Olivia Baskerville. I'm a doctoral student at the Institute of English Studies at the University of London, and I haven't published a monograph, so I have questions, and I will be posing them today. Welcome to From Dissertation to Book, How to Plan and Write Your First Academic Monograph. We are joined, of course, by Charlie Rosier, who is lecturer in medieval history at the University of East Anglia. We're also joined to my right by Rosie Bonte, publishing manager at Beppels Academic Publishers, who specialises in works on archaeology, Scandinavian studies, and European medieval history, and who has a PhD from the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic Studies at Cambridge University. To Charlie's right, we have Laura Gathagan. Gathagan, sorry, I meant to ask in advance. Associate Professor at State University of New York, the author of many books on gender and power in Anglo-Norman Europe, and editor of countless more, including editing the annual journal of the Haskins Society. And to her right, I'm very pleased to have my co-host with Charlie on the podcast and postdoctoral research associate at the University of Bristol, Rachael Harkes. And Rachael is just this summer, submitting the manuscript of her first monograph to the University of London Press. So she has the most direct experience. Anyway, thank you all very much for your patience and all this. We're going to do about 45 to 60 minutes of discussion, and then we'll do about 30 to 45 minutes of question and answer at the end. But I want to start us off with a question for kind of all of the panelists, which is, why might I want to turn my PhD into a book? Who wants to start? Rachael, you're doing it at the moment.
You're doing it.
Okay.
You tell us.
I'll give two reasons. Hopefully I'm not stealing answers from my panelists. The first is about academic career progression in higher education in the UK, at least. Having a monograph out is important for finding a job. And so it's partly to fulfill that requirement, but more importantly, and certainly what's pushed me through doing it, is the fact that I really want to get my research out there and engage in the dialogue that's happening in my field of scholarship. And the easiest way to do that in long form is to produce a monograph. So I want to tell people what I found and what I'm interested in.
Okay. Love it. Yeah, Laura.
All right, I'll give an answer that sort of also says why you might not want to. So,
that's very useful.
In the U.S. context, which is where I come from, it is not always required to publish a monograph. So I've had a lot of colleagues who instead use their dissertation, they sort of cannibalize it for articles, right? Which is another way of getting publication credit. So depending on where you are in the process, a monograph is really important, but you also want to get something out there into the public space. So another model might be use a chunk of your dissertation to rework into an article and save the most easy to sort of separate from the main focus, and use the rest of it for your monograph going forward. In my experience, I didn't need a monograph to get tenure. We in the United States have this thing called tenure, and once you get it, they can't really fire you unless you do something really actionable. So it wasn't important for me to do a monograph then, but it was important for me to do a monograph later for the very reasons that Rachael outlined right there. I wanted to present my research to the world at large. A monograph is the easiest way to do that, in a lovely package. And I did want to involve myself in the debates, and in my case, Anglo-Norman women in power, and that is why I did my monograph.
I echo all of those answers, actually, and kind of add a couple more. My monograph that I finished a few years ago came from a part of my PhD dissertation that I then took and expanded into the areas that my examiners told me it should go into when we were in our viva. So it kind of used the rest of the dissertation for articles, but that gave me a chance to really explore and expand some of the things I'd done in my PhD. Because I don't know what the makeup of the room is, but I think when you finish a PhD, you realise what PhD you should have written after you finished it, and hopefully you pass. So I basically did that and decided to write the book that I wanted to write. So my experience of writing a monograph was that it was fun, and it allowed me to, parts of it weren't, but it allowed me to explore the things that I really most wanted to understand. So it gave me a chance to expand that part of the dissertation. So yeah, I echo what you said about that. I'm interested now what the publisher thinks.
Well, I mean, it's hard to go last after and find something different to say here. I mean, I think, again, my answer is probably twofold. One of the reasons for taking a monograph forward, or for turning your PhD into a monograph, is often, certainly in a UK context, you're often quite constrained word-wise. So sometimes, I mean, I know when I did my PhD, I started off with grand ambitions and then just didn't have the words. So I was like, right, that section's going and that section's going, and my PhD is now only the middle section. And, you know, the idea is that you can then go back, add the material in that you had to miss out. And I think because when you're writing your PhD, you know it's going to be read, but it's going to be read by a very small audience of your examiners. And the monograph is really a chance to get it out there and find it reaching a much wider audience and sort of engage with scholarship on a much broader level. But the flip side of that, going back to what Laura said, is that not all PhDs necessarily lend themselves to monographs. And I think you really do need to have a look at your PhD and think, well, you know, does it have to be a monograph? Does it lend itself to a monograph? Should I do what Charlie did and just take one aspect of it and extend it in a different way? Am I doing a load of disparate case studies that would really work better as individual journal articles? You know, so I think it's a case of also, does your PhD work as a sort of thematic, coherent book? How much rewriting are you going to have to do?
Okay. If that's the case, what kind of PhD makes a good monograph?
I think it's got to be something that sort of can reach a wider audience. I mean, as I say, I know in a UK context, which is obviously my background, as I say, your PhD is going to be read. It's going to be read by your supervisor, by your internal examiner, and by your external examiner. But that might be the only readership it's really going to get. For a publisher to invest in your book and spend the money it takes to copy edit, to typeset and so on, realistically we're hoping to maybe sell, all right, it's not masses, but 150 copies, you know, that would be good. But we're hoping to reach a wider audience, so it needs to be that bit broader. It needs to be maybe setting things in a broader socio-political context, taking the time to explain where your research fits in the broader fit of what's going on elsewhere in the world, maybe jettisoning your review of scholarship, but taking the time to explain to somebody from an adjacent career field or maybe a first year undergraduate things that now seem obvious to you. You know, by the time you've done something for 7 years, you know this stuff, so you know, oh, it's established fact that this person wrote this manuscript. But maybe a first year undergraduate doesn't, and maybe you need to take the time to actually explore this in a bit more detail and explain how you came to the conclusions that you did. I think it needs to be coherent. You need to have a narrative that goes through the book, and you're effectively taking your reader by the hand and saying, this is where we're starting, this is where we're going, and here's how we're going to explore the evidence. So if you end up with a PhD thesis that's sort of a lot of disparate case studies, that doesn't lend itself so well because you're lacking that sort of overarching coherency, which is what you need from a monograph.
Okay. If one does decide that one's PhD is potentially book viable, this is a question for anybody on the panel, but particularly Rosie, but also at least one of the authors. What value does a publisher add? Like, in this world, I can just publish myself online if I want to. What does it add to go to an academic publisher?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm going to say that publishers are useful. We have an editorial board who start off by assessing the proposal, will give you decent guidance and feedback about how you might improve your proposal, what you might add to it. The idea is that the editorial board is very supportive and will comment on your proposal from the get-go, so that then when you go to peer review, we're minimising problems. We are, of course, going to handle the peer review process. You know, if you just stick it online, you can have added anything in there. It's not been through that rigorous peer review process. And of course, I can only speak for Brepols here, but we are very hands-on the manuscript. When you get your manuscript, it's going to be worked on in-house. We're going to tidy up things, even little things like, you know, adding non-breaking spaces after circa, or tidying up footnotes so that all the page numbers are given consistently. Then we do a full copy edit, so it's being read through line by line by somebody with a background in the field. Then we're handling the typesetting, so it's a professional layout. And then we're making it available online and in print form worldwide. We're protecting your intellectual property, you know, from a legal position. We're handling the marketing, and we're making sure it's read. So I think a publisher can bring a lot to the field, because we're working with you to take this from, okay, I've written this in Word and I'm putting it online, to this is a high-end, peer-reviewed, high-quality product that should really stand the test of time.
authors? Charlie?
I've got one small thing to add. Having a publisher and having a contract gives you a deadline.
Oh, yes.
And that gives you motivation.
Yeah, fair.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Right.
But I will say one other thing, too. I mean, in the best case scenario, and I think Breppels is very good about this, your interaction with your publisher is a conversation, a back and forth dialogue in which you're both really invested in turning out the best monograph that you possibly can. And no one likes peer review. It always makes you feel like someone slapped your favorite child. However, it's such an important part of that process, and having a publisher that has your best interests at heart, it's invaluable.
Can I add something that we haven't talked
Please.
about, but Rosie's comment made me think that having an editorial board as well as peer reviewers is like free advertising, because lots of academic discourse is through word of mouth, right?
Yeah.
So if you have an editorial board of 12 people who've read your proposal and been like, this book's going to be really great, I'm going to tell my students about it, my colleagues, etc.
Right.
That's smart rather than just sticking it on Amazon.
Is this a good place to talk about series?
Feel free.
So, do you want to talk about that later?
No, do it. No, talk about it.
Talk about whatever you want.
Both Charlie and I are editors of series, or yours is coming. Yours is up and coming, right? So I'm a series editor with Charles Inslee at Manchester for a series called Medieval Documentary Cultures. There are lots and lots of series. Breppels have series. Boydell, where I am, has many series. So as a first-time monograph author, you may be wondering, like, why would I bother to try to fit my monograph into a series? And it's a lot of what you were just talking about. So you have an additional layer of review, you have an additional layer of people who are interested and invested in your monograph and want it to do well. Series editors want a nice, healthy list. So they are very invested in your monograph going forward in their series. So there's another layer, not just of review, but of people who are really gunning for your book to be successful.
Yep, thanks very much. And we're going to talk a little bit more about things like open access and how you know how best to publish your work going forward. That's going to take me to one final question before we move on to other topics. But how do I approach a publisher? Or does a publisher approach me?
How about we ask Rosie how not to approach a publisher?
Part of my question here is about understanding the power dynamic between academics and publishers. Who is the impetus for academic publishing coming from?
Again, I think it's more of a dialogue, to be honest. I mean, I think sometimes people approach us, sometimes at conferences we approach people. I mean, for Leeds, for example, I will literally just go through the conference program and I flag up what sessions and papers look interesting with an eye to what series I manage and where I can imagine this research fitting. Sometimes I'll talk to end-stage PhDs because, you know, what might you be doing with your PhD thesis? Sometimes I'm talking to people about the sessions they've organised and, oh, have you thought about making this into an edited collection? Or sometimes it's just to find out, you know, what are you working on right now? Okay, that's fine, you're working with a different publisher, but here's what might be useful 5 years down the line when you're on to monograph number 2 or number 3 or what have you. But I think it is a bit of a dialogue. You know, I would always say do your research, you know, ask around, see who your supervisor or your advisor recommends you publish with, see who colleagues have published with. One publisher might be brilliant in one area but not so good in another area, you know, and take your time. I would always say do chat to more than one publisher and find the publisher that you think, yeah, they've got my back, they're going to get me through this. And you've got to find somebody who you're comfortable working with. Do check out things like rankings, which publishers are ranked highly. Check out what services they offer. You know, some different publishers work in different ways. Some are going to want a hefty subvention to take your book forward. Some will cover all the costs themselves. Some don't peer review, some do. Make sure that you're finding one that fits the criteria you've got. I think if a publisher does contact you, that's great. It's always worth going along for a chat. The only other key thing I would say is that once you start getting serious and you send in a proposal and you're starting to talk and getting feedback from the editorial boards, we don't take it brilliantly well to then find out you're also in talks with 5 other publishers, and especially once we're putting cold hard cash on the table for peer review. If 4 different publishers find out they've all spent X amount of money on a manuscript and none of them, and then it turns out they're going with publisher number 5, it doesn't go down brilliantly, is all to say. So I'd say once you're at the stage where you're submitting a proposal, you're submitting a manuscript for peer review, we would expect you to be serious about moving forwards with us.
Okay, I'd like to talk more at some point about that, where the proposal meets the contract. But first I want to ask the authors, does that chime with your experience of being approached, having approached publishers?
Yeah, it does. I would say one thing. If you've already published something in a journal and you're happy with that process, and that journal is published by a publishing house, it's worth checking out that editorial board, the series they have. If you've had a good experience already, even on a small scale, it's worth going forward and seeing what those folks are like. Breppels, Boydell, lots of people publish journals, so that's something to think about. If you've had an experience, even on on sort of a small scale, it's worth checking that out. Rosie would say this anyway, I think, but just be aware that when it's time to actually pitch something for real, you should have a proposal and 2 sample chapters, probably.
Yeah, I think for a monograph we'd want at least 1 sample chapter to move forward with, definitely.
So that's your first goal, right?
I mean, just one other thing that occurs to me, and it doesn't happen very often, but it's worth putting out there, is if the publisher likes your proposal, but the editorial board say no, ultimately it's not, there's not a lot we can do. We rely on the editorial board for their expertise. So I will just say I've had some massively abusive emails in my time because I've solicited a book and then it's not gone forwards, and I get emails that I will not repeat here, and I've had threats that I will not repeat here, but it doesn't go down well either, and word does get around because all the publishers hang out together. So if you are massively abusive and threaten to do unspeakable things to your publisher, the other publishers will also hear about it.
Or just really snarky.
Top tips.
Oh, snarky I would take. Snarky I can take. It's the threats of violence that I found a little more intimidating.
Good point.
No one in this room.
I'm just throwing it out there, like threatening to stab the publisher isn't well received, for example.
You have all been warned. That actually brings me on to a question which I want to pose to one of the authors, maybe Charlie or Rachel in this case. What does the proposal process entail? What did it entail for you? And then maybe Rosie can kind of comment on that.
Okay. So for context, my monograph is being published for the University of London Press, but it's in the Royal Historical Society's new Historical Perspective series. And they have a very clear process in which they ask potential authors to submit. So you get a form that you have to fill out, but in it I had to write a summary of the entire book. I think it was about 300 words maybe. A paragraph on each of the chapters. I had to write about potential audiences, how I would advertise the book, what channels and networks I had. And so we could really expand the scope and the reach of the monograph. And then things like your bio, who you are, and potential reviewers as well, which is a really good opportunity to suggest people, whether the editorial board goes with any of your suggestions, but you obviously know your own work very well and know who would make sense to be a reviewer. So,
and that was all part of your kind of initial pitch?
That was my initial pitch, which was then submitted with a chapter, which we've already discussed. So
I'd say also, if at all you have access to this, if you know anybody who's done this recently in a couple of years beforehand, you could ask them if they could maybe share their proposal with you, or if they will read your proposal and give you feedback on it. Academia really works on these nice, informal, generous gestures like that. So if you have access to that, then do that. I got my book proposal for my monograph. So the first contact I had with a publisher was really early on in my PhD. I went to the Kalamazoo Medieval Congress. Anyone been there? It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah. I was in the pub quite late on, and someone said, "Come and meet this publisher," who I'd heard of and was terrified of. And she said, "Oh, what's your PhD on?" And I told her, and she said, "Yeah, that's good. We'll have that. When you're finished, let me know." And it was a very kind of, informal, lucky kind of meeting. And that's what publishers are at conferences to do, really, isn't it? Is meet people, have those informal associations.
We're here to network, but, we're also human, and most of us have come from an academic background. And to be honest, we just like a good chat, to be honest. I love hearing about other people's research. I mean, I did medieval Scandinavia for 7 years straight. It's lovely to suddenly hear about the world outside of medieval Scandinavia. It's like, I was doing a book not that long ago on rock art giraffes in Nubia, and I can't tell you how happy the rock art giraffes made me. It was like, it's so different to Viking and medieval Scandinavia. One thing I will say is that most publishers do tend to have sort of their own proposal form online, so it's worth just checking online, and it is worth taking the time to fill it in. I mean, it does make me laugh when I get something and it's on the proposal form for a different publishing house. It's like, come on guys. But it's
it's like job applications. Like, make sure you know who you're.
Make sure you've at least changed the name of the publishing house in your blurb.
And that actually brings me to my next question, which is, who is the audience for your proposal? Is it an editor? Is it the editorial board? Is it your peer reviewers? Is it somebody else?
It's generally going to go to, in our case, to the editorial board first. So I'll sort of do an initial look, and I think, this is worth sending on to the editorial board. Definitely let's get some feedback. Brappol's, I will say, we tend to wait to see the initial proposal form before we'll invite in a sample chapter. The idea is the proposal form shouldn't actually take too long to fill in. So that's our initial thing. If it's clear that, for whatever reason the scholarship's lacking or it's just not quite the right fit, we wouldn't invite in the sample chapter, because we'll send on the sample chapter to an external reader. So, we want to make sure it's the right fit and so on before we invite that in. With regards to what you were saying about peer reviewers, it's also useful to let us know people that you don't want to peer review, because it turns out there are academic feuds out there that the publisher doesn't know anything about, and before you know it, you're up to your eyeballs in this academic feud, and it's like, I did not know that this happened 30 years ago, and they're still not speaking about the fall of Rome, and it's terrible. So, do just, if there's anybody you really want us to avoid as well, do let us know, because we do take that into account, and it's helpful background.
Great. And let's say you do get your proposal accepted. When can you expect to get your contract? What is the point at which your book has become secure and you know that if you write it, it will be published?
Yeah, for a monograph, we do an external review on the sample chapter, and that's one of the reasons why we'd invite in a sample chapter. And if that's good, we can contract it at that point. Of course, the full manuscript has still got to go through review, but we're working on the assumption that the sample chapter's good, the manuscript's going to be good. For edited collections, it's of course a bit more difficult, because you can have one brilliant chapter, but it's an edited collection, so we just tend to wait for that until we've got the full manuscript. We'd like to put the full manuscript through review before we'll issue a contract.
Has that been your experience, authors? Anything to add?
Do you want to add something?
I was just going to say, we discussed earlier about negotiating contracts. Now, this isn't about, no, I want £10,000, not 3, because you're not going to get anything, really. Let's just put it out there. You might get a small amount of royalties, but probably enough to pay for a few coffees at your next Leeds, whatever. But what I did negotiate in my contract was that the publisher had a standard contract that they issued to most people, and one of the clauses was that they would have first refusal on my next monograph, and I asked them to remove that because I just wanted to keep my options open, and they were happy to remove it. But it's just worth reading it all and thinking, if there's anything in the contract that does make you feel uncomfortable, then talk to your publisher about it. They're usually really nice people. Do that.
We're pretty reasonable.
I was thinking about the proposal process also. I love Charlie's idea about hooking up with other people who have proposed books and how helpful that is. But also, if you have a mentor, it doesn't have to be your dissertation advisor at all, but if you have someone in the field whose work you respect, who knows your subgenre.
That's you for me.
That's right. Send it along to that person. Let them take a look at it. Let them cast their eyes on it. More review, always better. More review, always better. right? So it's really worth having somebody who cares about your work and wants you to do well to take a look at all of that. Right?
Absolutely.
Same goes for sample chapters. So if you are invited to send them along, please don't send them cold. That is a very bad idea. So have someone cast their eyes on it, even if it's just for copy editing. You really want to put your best foot forward. You don't want to lose the opportunity to get this published. So have that sort of person take a look at your work before you send it along. And you can even say in your email to the publisher, just so you know, this person has looked at this, blah, 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 blah. And that is also a good thing.
Nice, I like that. Being like, anyway, one of your own authors already
Right.
has had a
You know
look.
what I'm talking about, right? Oh, by the way, Elizabeth Van House has looked at my...
Yeah.
But it is so important. I mean, obviously, I'm a publisher, but I did my PhD before I went into publishing. I do still do research, and I edited a volume last year. And I still went through all this, and I still got my former PhD supervisor to comment on the proposal just for the edited collection. I was like, what do you think about this? Can you give me any feedback about this? Will you read my chapter? Because, you know, I still want that sort of feedback on my scholarship.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I feel you.
it's
And can I
Quality
add something
control.
as well? Because it depends where you're submitting your monograph to. Because I knew that my editorial board were not composed of medievalists. That there was only two medievalists on it, and then the rest were not. So I had people who are outside my specialism read it. Even just another medievalist, Charlie, read my proposal, and we don't work on the same field. But even that kind of removal was very helpful to be like, how can I make my proposal more accessible, and why should other historians care about it who don't care about like medieval England?
I would also add really quickly one small thing, because I know we have to move on. But like, if you're asking for help from people in all these various things that we've recommended, also pick someone who you know is going to get back to you in a good amount of time. Because so much of this is trying to get it done as quick as possible, as well as possible at the same time. Always ask people who you know are reliable, who will get back to you quickly. Because that's just as important as giving you good advice, but only in 2 years' time.
Okay, timing is everything.
Timing.
I want to move us on to the actual manuscript itself, because I know it's a huge question for authors. Authors on the panel, how hard is it to turn to write a monograph? To turn a PhD into a monograph, or indeed to write a monograph? Should I be thinking of turning my PhD into a monograph as like a fairly simple, straightforward process where I'm going to change a few things in a few chapters at the editor's request and then send it off and everything will be hunky-dory? Or is it going to take me forever? And what is the process? What is your process?
Why don't you ask Rachel, because she's doing it.
Yeah, go on.
I feel like I have to like hold myself together because I feel it.
Well, hold you, Rachel.
Thank you. Again, everyone's going to have such different experiences because it really depends on how you're changing your PhD into your first monograph. So I've taken 3 chapters from my PhD and added on and expanded and done new research for the second half of the monograph. So it's been challenging, I would say. I thought it would be easier than the PhD, but I'm not convinced right now that it actually is. But in a way, what I find helpful is that my intellectual thinking has developed so much since I finished the PhD, and that's a really refreshing way to then expand my research, and it's kind of helping me push through. But give yourself more time than you think you need. I would say, just like the PhD, when you're trying to finish the PhD, you're like, oh, I'm definitely going to finish it in like X amount of time. But it's usually 6 months later than the date that you set.
Oh, Rachel, you're pulling my heartstrings here.
So I would say I count that for your book as well, at least in my opinion.
For me, it was very, very difficult, I have to say. One of the hardest things for me was the little bits and pieces at the end when you think you're pretty much done with the whole thing, but then there are these bits, my maps, my illustrations, my index, my tables, this footnote. Why did I say Leonie Hicks Norman stuff? Why did I do that? Now I have to go find out what the heck I was talking about. So, so all these little bits and pieces just drag that process out quite a bit. And like you, I found that my thinking about my subject, which is a biography of a person, had changed so dramatically since my PhD because of research I'd done, manuscripts I'd found, et cetera, et cetera. It almost didn't even resemble the thing that I had done, my dissertation. Like, it didn't even resemble it, really. So I think it's actually a lot harder than the PhD.
Can I add something that makes it even harder? And that's the current world that early career researchers live in. Right, so I am still on a temporary contract 10 years after my PhD finished. I have only ever been on temporary contracts, and in every one of those jobs I've basically had to teach new courses every year, pretty much from scratch, and try and write research around it, right? So be aware that you may be in that situation. Rachel's on a really cool postdoctoral project, but you don't necessarily get time to write your monograph because you've got project work to do, right? And some people I know are on really incredibly heavy teaching loads and they can't find the time to do the work. So I always say this, a number of times I've said this on our podcast, you guys are so bored of it. But for me, I wrote my book because I carved out time for myself every day, 2 hours, 5 days a week, 8 o'clock till 10 o'clock every morning, did some monograph work, even if it was just read 2 articles. But it kept it in my brain and it kept me constantly chipping away at it, so I didn't just forget about it for 2 months and then go, oh crap, I've done nothing, how am I ever going to finish this book? So you have to also know what type of writer you are and what type of academic you are and how to make it work. Because you are the only one who's going to write it. Not anyone else. It's your book. You are the only one who's going to finish it. Sorry to end on a dad note.
Absolutely right.
Rachel and I do not want to hear this right now.
No, sorry.
But no,
Absolutely right.
these are wise words. I mean, I finished my PhD and started working for Brepols like 2 days later, and I had my son during my PhD. So I was like, I had a tiny baby, I finished my PhD, I had a full-time job. Yeah, I was going to do a monograph. My PhD thesis still lives in a drawer. I open it occasionally and go, ugh, and then shut the drawer again. Because the thing is, you get to 10 o'clock at night and you think, well, I could read about Vikings, or I could have a glass of wine and watch Netflix. And I know what's winning right now. So I've just, in the end, I carved it up into articles because that's what I had the time to do. Which I think the point is, you've really got to want it, but also life does sort of get in the way, and particularly as you get older, you've got family, you've got jobs and everything. It's and I think if you do sort of stray a little bit outside academia and you end up with a desk job, it becomes even harder because there's never any research time, so it's, you know, it's not even expected.
I do also want to just say, like, based on the thing I just said, like, I don't hold myself up as like everyone should be like me because I'm amazing. Like, if you knew me when I was writing my monograph, you did.
You know you're amazing, Charlie.
It wasn't always great. It wasn't always brilliant.
Are you currently writing a monograph as well?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'm trying.
Is it going better?
No, I've had the peer review, so maybe not. But the point is, like, know yourself and know what works for you, because everybody is different. We never say on our podcast episodes, you must do this. We say, I did this and it made me feel like this. And that's the same for writing a book.
And it just sounds like doing your PhD all over again, to be honest.
Yeah.
Okay, but obviously in the case of publishing a book with an academic publishers, you also have an editor. So I wonder if maybe, Laura, you've kind of been both.
Yes,
I mean, as have you, Rosie, but I wonder if you can both talk to the relationship between writer and editor and how, like, the extent to which you can rely on them or what you can expect of them and how you work with an editor.
Sure. I'd like to reinforce the idea that it's very much a dialogue. Your editor is going to have expectations of you that are important for you to fulfill. However, there is a time and place for pushing back against what that editor wants. You are the expert in your tiny little field, right? You're sitting here because you are doing something no one else has really done in the same way. So that editor is in many ways your Sherpa through the sort of, peaks and scary valleys of the publishing process. But the one thing they don't know is what you know. So it's important that you stand firm for the things you really believe in. I have a monograph that has a really weird structure. It's based on body parts instead of a chronological biography. And it was really hard to find someone who would embrace that for me, but it was do or die for me. So it's important to find an editor that has your same vision. You do have to trust that person, right, to get you through the process. But it's also, when peer review comes back, for instance, and they want you to adjust something, it's really important to be sure that stays true to your vision. so it's a very it's a fine line, but you also have to trust your instincts as well. From the editorial perspective, however, I would say, be open to ideas that you had not thought about. Be open to reorganizing what you've done to make it more marketable, because that's what they're really, really good at.
Rosie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good editorial board, as I say, the point is they're on your side and they want to get the book out. We want to help make the best book possible. I think one thing that Brepols does, and I can't speak for other publishers, but we run what we call a shepherding scheme, which is a very twee term, but it's a really nice idea. So the idea is that once your book is under contract, you've had your peer reviews, whoever on the editorial board has closest research interests to your book is then your person. And, if your shepherd. And if reviewer 2 is ridiculous and you disagree with reviewer 2, the idea is that you can actually go back to your shepherd and be like, I'm not sure how to handle this point of view, because, I actually disagree with it, and what do you think, and how should we engage with it? And the idea is that it's peer-to-peer support, really. It's somebody in your field who can be like, okay, yeah, actually, I agree with you. Let's engage with it like this. So you don't have to make these changes, but you have to engage with the criticism in some way. And the idea as well is that they'll do last checks on the manuscript before it goes into production, so it's almost like another level of just checking that everything's fine, that this manuscript is good quality. So it's that extra level of support, and I think that's what a good editor of a series can bring as well.
And it helps prevent you from becoming beholden to editor 2, as it were. It helps you
because it can often be difficult. I mean, I did get a lovely email the other day going, we disagreed with reviewer 2, so we hope that you don't mind if we ignore that. And I was like, well, I do mind, actually. It's like you can disagree, but you have to engage with it in some way. Nobody expects, it's not obligatory for you to accept all changes. Sometimes scholarship is ultimately about different people having different views. But as long as you can robustly challenge those views, that's fine. But the fact that they flagged it means you need to engage with it in some way. You can't just, stick your fingers in your ears and go, la, 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 it's not happening. But I think that's one thing a good editor can also help you with. They can say, well, yes, this is a critique that might be raised. You're taking this line of thought, so you are disagreeing with them. That's fine, but you have to acknowledge this critique and therefore engage with it by saying X, Y, Z.
Okay. That's right. So really, your editor is there to facilitate the process of you writing a book becoming an academic dialogue in and of itself.
Right.
Yeah.
And not just that you have to produce something that's
exactly
effectively perfect.
Right.
And sort of send it to them and say, please copy, edit, and print.
Yes.
Okay.
Indeed.
Right, exactly.
How long does that process take? And especially importantly, how hard are the deadlines? I want to cast over to some of the authors actually first. I'd like to know how long does it take?
Written your book to its deadline?
Well, my deadline is the end of July, so
we'll
2
find out.
weeks.
So stand by for updates.
Yeah.
Tune into podcast for updates.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was 2 weeks late.
Okay.
That's pretty good, right?
Oh, wow.
There's 2
I
weeks
was
left.
like 3 or 4 years late. but, yeah, go on.
Oh, did you sign a contract that had a particular date on it?
I did.
Okay.
But what I did was I was in regular dialogue with my publisher. Rosie will love this. Regular dialogue with your publisher.
Yeah.
With my, what's the job called? What's Caroline's job?
Acquisitions
editor, commissioning editor is her job. So I talked to her at lots of different conferences just to let her know how I was going. I think because she knew me and thought I was a kind of reliable person, hopefully, she trusted me with that leeway. And the main thing is tell them if stuff comes up. The reasons why I was so late was because I had to write 50 lectures from scratch every year for the next academic job that I'd managed to get, so I can cling on to my career for a little bit longer. That's the price you pay. If you want to do it, sometimes you just have to make it work. But the publisher knew that I could do it because I'd done an edited volume a couple of years before for them, and we like to think that was a really good edited volume. So she knew I'd get it done eventually to a high standard. It just took longer than I thought.
Okay.
But dialogue is the most important thing.
I agree with
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
Even from the editor of a journal perspective, like even that, if you're going to be late, okay, but you've got to contact. You have to be in touch. And the shame spiral that you're inevitably in cannot include ignoring your editor.
Okay, your editor is your friend. Communication.
We will make room for you, but you have to talk to us. Right, Rosie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, one of my favourite quotes is Douglas Adams, and he said, I like deadlines, I like the whooshing noise they make as they go past.
A classic of the genre.
Yeah, and I think most people do miss their deadlines slightly, and I do get that. You know, and I think it's better to.
Rachel's thinking, why am I writing my book on time? Why am I on
I think
Next year sounds good.
it's about being flexible, and I think if you say to me, look, I actually need 3 more months to get this into the shape I want it. Fair enough, you need 3 more months. Why? There's absolutely no point in me going, nope. We've got to hit this deadline, because all that's going to happen is it's going to go to peer review. You're going to have more corrections to make because you didn't quite get it finalised. Okay, take those 3 months. But it's a dialogue. If I don't know what's going on and I haven't heard from you and you're ghosting me, I don't know whether the book's happening. I don't know whether you've died. I don't know. I don't know if you've run off and found a different publisher. I have no clue what's going on. So I need the dialogue, and I need to be able to just plan, because I also have like I've got a massive spreadsheet of all the titles, and I know what's due when. So all that happens is if you say to me, look, you know, I initially said August 2025. It's now June 2025, and it's not going to happen. That's fine. Just email me and be like, we're now on to October 2025, and I log on to my giant spreadsheet and be like, okay, I know this is now due in October. I need to start looking for peer reviewers at this point so that we can plan ahead. But otherwise, sometimes you've got peer reviewers lined up, and then the manuscript doesn't come in, and then the manuscript doesn't come in, and by the time it comes in, the peer reviewers are like, don't have time anymore. And so it's not just me it's affecting other people as well. So we just need to know. I'm not going to shout. I'm just going to be like, okay, thank you for letting me know.
So the deadline on the contract is there for the publishers to be able to plan their.
It's a planning as much as anything.
As it were. Okay,
yeah.
Not because for whatever reason your monograph is necessarily immediately pressing and has to happen kind of on that month, on that date.
Well, the thing is, by the time it goes in for peer review, you know, we're not talking this year's list, we're probably talking next year's list anyway, so we have got that lag time and a bit of flexibility. At Brappol's, we announce our books 6 months ahead of time, so if, say, we're in January and it's going to come out in June, it's on the website by January. At that point, I do get very stressed because I've said it's got to be out by the end of June. It's in our forthcoming titles catalogue, it's on our website, and I start getting bawled out at that point if the book's late. You know, I've got targets to meet, and I'm getting, where is this book? Why is it not out yet? What have you done? And it's like, okay, well, you know, the book needs to come out. But before that point, there is that leeway, you know. It's not announced on the website yet, so people aren't placing pre-orders yet, so we've not got that external expectation. Let's just, you know, but that's once it's in production.
What's manageable.
Yeah.
Okay, so that does bring me on to a topic I think most people in this room will want some information about, that we've talked about for a bit, but is peer review. And I want to ask the authors, what's your best peer review experience?
Do you want to start?
So I had peer review on my proposal and the sample chapter. Obviously, I've not submitted the monograph, so I don't have an experience of peer review on the monograph yet. Yeah, I'm not sure. Actually, I have very much to say about the peer review.
We'll come back to you with more questions later. Laura?
My best experience with peer review, I had a reviewer who, in all the cases, I have to admit, they had been really engaged in my project, for which I'm very, very grateful. And even if they said things I wasn't really mad about or didn't agree with, it was so useful for them to bring something up that either, you know, so that I could combat that line in the manuscript itself and acknowledge this is something people have been saying or thinking, or even better, you know, what I really enjoy is when they say, you know, this is an excellent point. You need to make more of it. And also, you need to reorganize this chapter because you lost me at this moment. So just the organizational structure, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I'm so close to a project and I've been in it forever, It's really hard to back up and say, you know what, this little section really belongs over here. That's the kind of peer review I think is super helpful. Organization, sort of structural questions and elements. And, also, it's rare. I mean, you guys are the experts in your field. So it's going to be rare for someone to say, oh, have you read this one thing? Probably not, right? But that happens, and that's great. But what really helps is the organizational.
Structural.
I feel like asking you what's your favourite peer review process is a bit like what's your favourite torture method that you'd like to, like, what way would you like to die? I don't know. But yeah, it's a good question.
Peer review is so difficult and awful, and I think it's interesting to think about what constitutes positive peer review.
I think when you read peer review as an author, the thing you've got to realise is that they're not peer reviewing you as a person. They're peer reviewing this one piece of work that you've done. So the first time you read critical peer review, you go away and you cry, and you think like, why am I so useless? What am I doing? But then, for me, usually it's a couple of hours later I go, well, maybe they've got a point. Or yeah, maybe that works, maybe that doesn't. So for the book I'm trying to write at the moment, I sent my sample chapters in January this year and had them peer reviewed, and it came back quite quickly, which I was very grateful for. And the first reviewer loved it and wanted to publish it. The second reviewer said that there were all kinds of structural problems and it needed to be reorganised as a book. So I sent it to peer reviewer 3, who said, I don't know, you guys decide. So I was like, thanks, peer reviewer 3. But I talked to some informal mentors of mine, and I had some Zoom conversations with people who've written similar books. And I realised that actually that really critical peer reviewer 2 that said I should restructure the whole book actually had a point. And if I write a better book because of it, then it was worth going through that process.
Rosie's nodding like, yeah, everybody comes back to realise reviewer 2 has a point.
I'm just thinking a good peer review should be, yes, they're critical, but in a constructive way. And I think people generally accept, if somebody's saying, well, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think you should do this and this and this, then yes, you can go away and think about it and be like, actually, yes. If somebody just says, I don't like this, or this is wrong, that's not terribly helpful, because you're like, well, what do I do about it? How do I build on this? How do I change things? But if somebody's actually taken the time to guide out and say, I can see what you're doing here, but it would be brought out so much better if you brought in this material here, and if you took the time to do this, then yeah, at least it's constructive, and you can go away and think about it and be like, yeah, ultimately this will be a better book for the change. And as I say, you might disagree with it. That's the point where you can sort of go back to your editorial board and say, how do I engage with this? How do I respond to this? What do you think? But generally speaking, if it's constructive, you've got a way forwards for how to improve your manuscript. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is, if your peer reviewer is saying something, you can correct it. It's far better to have a more critical peer review than publish the book and then have it reviewed in journals where they're like, really, what was this person doing? You just don't want that. You don't want the bad reviews.
Can I just say something on that? After I published this first monograph, of which I'm very proud and it's part of the reason why I'm sitting here, one of my reviews noticed that in the introduction, when I ran through the chapters, in chapter 3 I'll do this, in chapter 4 I'll do this, etc., the numbers were wrong in the final published book, because I'd reorganised the chapter numbers at a really late stage and forgot to go back and change that bit of the introduction.
No.
So, it could be worse, right? Like, they could have said the whole book's crap, but yeah. So stuff like that still happens.
Stuff slips through anyway.
Yeah.
It's true.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, so I'm going to turn the mics, as it were, over to the room. We have a mic here for the Zoom.
Shall I go around and I'll do that?
Yeah, Charlie will bring you a...
So what we'll do is, when you have a question, for the purposes of recording, if you say it into this microphone so the Zoom people can hear it, for the recording, Olivia will repeat your question. Okay? So questions can be on absolutely anything at all. Raise your hands. Hopefully we'll fit everybody in. Where should we go? I feel like
start in the middle. Start at the back and move forward. There you go.
Anyone wants to
Charlie left. Charlie left. There you go. Start at the back and move forward. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting and really helpful. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about open access, and particularly I'm funded by AHLC. I don't really know how to negotiate that in terms of a monograph, so I wanted to get any advice.
Okay, thanks very much. So the question was about open access and how to negotiate that, and we did have that as a subtopic in case it was needed, because I think open access is a big question. Who wants to start?
Shall I start very briefly, just to, as it's going to sound like a plug for the series that I'm publishing in, but the Royal Historical Society's new Historical Perspective series publishes their monographs open access, in which they pay for the open access costs, so it is also worth exploring different options where you're not taking that financial burden, because there are some out there. So do your research and think about it. That is actually part of the reason why I chose that series, because open access is important. But I'll pass it over to other people who have other experiences of open access.
I might ask Rosie, could you just briefly cover what open access is and how it differs from pre-existing funding models for publishing?
Yeah, so for a lot of publishers, our basic approach is that we will cover all the costs ourselves. So, we're paying for copy editing, for marketing, for typesetting, and so on. Now, of course, we then rely on book sales to cover those costs, because, it can cost, for an average monograph, we're probably looking at €6,000 to €7,000. We can't afford to just fund that and not get any money back, basically. So if that book becomes freely available online and then nobody's buying the print copy, we've probably got a €7,000 hole in our budget, minimum, because we've still got to pay the copy editors, and we've still got to pay for the typesetting, and we've still got to pay for it to be hosted online and all the other myriad costs. So the idea about open access, and when it works really well with this funding, is that usually to make a book freely available online, we have to cover our investment in the book, because otherwise we will cease to function as a company. So the idea is that if you've got funding, for example, we will calculate how much it costs us to produce the book, and then that amount of money is covered by what we call a book processing charge. So very often people will have funding, they'll say, how much is it going to cost to make this book Gold Open Access? And we say, well, you've got 120,000 words and 62 images, so we're looking at this price. And we're literally just working out what our direct investment is, and we're asking for that to be covered. That's absolutely great if you've got funding, of course. And, it's a win-win situation. We don't end up out of pocket. It's freely available research, and that's a model that's called Gold Open Access. Now, there are other forms of open access. Sometimes, if you're lucky, for example, the Royal Historical Society monographs, there is external funding, and the series itself is made open access. So it's being funded by an external body. It's what's called Diamond Open Access, and you can go and publish in that series, and because there's already external funding available, you don't need to find the funding. Then there's a final form of open access, which is called green open access, and this is something that the AHRC, for example, ask for, which is where you don't have to have any funding, but the flip side of that is that there's an embargo period during which you can't share certain forms of the work online, and it's only, I think before the embargo period, the only work you can share is the pre-peer reviewed version of the text. And after the embargo period, you can share the post-peer reviewed version of the text, but it's not still the final copy edited and typeset version, because ultimately, if we start doing that, as I say, publishing companies are not going to last very long, because we can't afford to keep copy editing and typesetting and doing everything if we have to cover the costs and we're not able to recoup those costs through book sales. So those are your three basic models.
Okay. And I think the question, I had a specific question about if her funding comes from a particular place.
So it's AHLC, yeah, so they've made it a new requirement that monographs from the PhD work have to be open access, but it's a new system, so last I heard they haven't figured out all the details of that yet, which makes it confusing as a PhD student trying to negotiate that.
So the Arts and Humanities Research Council have a stipulation within their funding contracts for doctoral students that your PhD, if you publish it, has to be open access because they funded that work. Okay. Does anybody on the panel have an answer to that, or is that something we might have to...
The only thing I don't have an answer, But if you're still attached to an institution when you do publish your monographs, sometimes institutions have funding pots that you can apply to make that open access. Alternatively, I think maybe at least OUP, I think if you get a discount maybe on open access if you are alumni of Oxford or something like that. I don't know. That's a very specific example, but there are definitely some pots of money out there.
But I was going to say, my understanding is that this refers to green open access because they're not expecting you to have the funding. So it's basically about making a version of the text available, but it's not going to be the final version. So, and I think the AHRC are aware of that, but they're also aware that if they insisted on gold open access, they would effectively bankrupt all smaller publishing houses, and then you would be left with like 4 publishing houses and have very little choice. So my understanding of it is that it's green open access that they're trying to negotiate at present.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next question. Thank you. Charlie, there's one just here.
I was just wondering if we covered a little bit about like the contract of having the publisher and what not to do, but also I was wondering if there's anything in particular, like a way that you might lose a contract once it's signed or established. For example, if you're uber late or if something happens, or like, is there anything that would happen that would cause the publisher to kind of end the contract?
So the question is there anything that can cause you to lose a contract once you've signed it?
Pretty much the only things would be if it massively failed peer review. And of course, if it's where we can, we'd far rather go for a revise and resubmit option as well. So we'll say, look, we can't take this forward as it is, but let's take these comments on board. We'll have to do another round of review. It's very rare that, we'd completely cancel a contract because the peer review is so catastrophic, but it has happened. I think other occasions are where we found somebody's massively plagiarised, but we found this out before it went into print, so we were able to go back and say, well, look, you've signed this contract in which you are saying you are not going to plagiarise material, and behold all the plagiarised material. And they were. And otherwise, I think the only other thing would be if you then went and published all of the same material with a different publisher before it comes out with us. And would be like, well, we've signed a contract to publish this, but apparently you've just effectively put half of it into a book with somebody else and you want to reuse the material verbatim. This can't happen, and effectively that's self-plagiarising in any case. But those are really the only cases I can think of. It's if we've already signed a contract in advance, it's pretty much because we've already seen a sample chapter. And if the sample chapter is good, it's because, and we've issued a contract, it's because we've got faith that the rest of the book's going to be good, and an external review has said this is good material. So based on that, it is quite rare that I think we would dissolve a contract.
Have faith in yourself.
Yeah, have faith in yourself.
You wrote the first chapter, you can write the rest
exactly.
of them.
If the first chapter is good enough to merit a contract, the likelihood of the rest of the book being catastrophic is unlikely.
Okay, next question, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. My question is about what to do when you are actually several years removed from finishing your PhD and your supervisor has retired and she'll never be contacted again or has perished, unfortunately. What do you do also, perhaps in my situation, I'm going through all of that, but also, I'm the only person in my department, and I work at a very small institution, have no mentorship. So what can I do? How do I know how to find publishers at a conference? Where do I seek out that mentorship without feeling like an undue burden on random people?
I have a great answer for that.
Well, hang on, Laura, I got to repeat. So thank you very much for your question. I think if I were to summarize it, the question would be, what do you do if you feel very alone in the whole process? and thank you very much for your candor with that. I'm sorry to hear it. Laura, you had a
I have
response.
so much to say about this. So
Talk to her afterwards. That'll be
yeah,
mine.
we will chat more.
Talk
We'll
to
chat
Laura.
more. But my PhD advisor passed away. In fact, in the middle of my PhD. So I was given another advisor who really had nothing to do with what I was doing, and she was incredibly generous and kind, but she was absolutely out of my field. When I got out of that world as well, I did not get an academic job right away. So it was really, really tough to find ways to get supported. So here's my advice to you. Your subgenre, your subfield has conferences of its own. Go to those. And find the people who do what you do. Chances are very good, because now I am that person, chances are very good they will be more than happy to take you on board and talk to you about your work. That is what we do as a community of scholars. That's what we're here for. So go to those conferences that are specific to your subfield and find those people, because we are there. We are waiting for you. We have also had difficult times. Many of us are the only medievalist in their department, right? So there are ways to do this. When I revisited my dissertation many, many, many years later, as I said earlier, it was a very different monograph. It's a very different book. That was a great improvement, but it's because I found mentors who helped me through that process. So do not despair. And if you want to talk more after, I found people who helped me, and they still do. So, yeah.
That's a great answer, Laura. Thank you. And I think don't be afraid to be vulnerable. As clearly, it isn't that vulnerable. I think that helps bring people to you. Any other questions? We've got plenty of time. We'll get them all in.
Thanks very much. I'm wondering about how much of a problem it is for publishers if you've already published a part of your dissertation, like as an article. And so even if you're if you're focusing and intending to reshape the dissertation and add new material and that sort of thing, is that enough, or do you have to essentially kind of axe that part of the project?
Thank you for your question. So the question was, how much of a problem is it if you've already published part of your dissertation and you're planning to include that part in your monograph, but you might be adding a bit to it, but it's still broadly the same as it was, and then of course is the rest of your work. Rosie, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it happens a lot. It does happen a lot. So it's something we're fairly used to. And I think a lot depends on the extent to which you're revising and reworking the material. The fact that you've already published something somewhere else isn't a deal breaker, because, of course, it's being reworked in the context of a much broader work. You are adding material and so on. The key question is, to what extent are you reusing the previous article verbatim? Now, if it's more than 250 words verbatim, you are going to have to go back to the previous publisher, and you're going to have to get permission, and you're going to have to cite it, and you're going to have to make it very explicit. This article or this chapter is based on something that was already published here. Because if you are citing more than 250 words verbatim, then you're sort of in breach of the copyright clause on your contract. What the publisher owns is not your intellectual property. They own a very specific set of ideas set down in a very specific way, i.e. in that word order, because that's what they've invested in, it's what they've copy edited, it's what they've typeset. We do expect you to go away to rework your ideas, to revise your ideas. You know, you see articles by some people and you're like, wow, I've read this before. Oh no, wait, it's new. There basically is the same article over again. It does happen a lot in academia. So we are, fully expectant of that. It's really just a case of to what extent you're revising and reworking your ideas, or literally quoting or citing from your previous article. And if you are using large chunks of the same text, you're going to have to get that copyright cleared.
Can I also add an answer to this? Because this happened to me with my book. Just after I finished my book, I had an article on one of the chapters that I expanded into a journal article. And I think for me, the solution was I just rewrote it. And I had different ideas, different word order, different kind of ways of expressing the same ideas. And as long as you're not literally copying the same words into the next piece of work, I think you're okay. You just have to rewrite it, and different ideas will come to you in a different order to what they did before. So probably it's okay.
Yeah, it's exactly that. As I say, the rule is literally more than 250 words verbatim. So
and that will be recognizable to anybody who has read one academic's work, right? That there are.
As I say, you do find yourself reading an article and you think, I'm sure I've read this before, and you're like, yeah, it's the same ideas, just different words.
Right.
It happens all the time, but people, authors, academics do rework and revise their ideas. It's part of the process of research. So,
next question, I think we have here in the middle.
Right, there is a very fundamental question that I have, which is probably totally naive. But
Please ask.
I feel that we're talking about two types of book. We're talking about the dissertation that you first write, and then we talk about the book that's going to be published. Why can one not write a dissertation that can be published?
No, I think that's a good question, and one that I have as well. Charlie, you going to come back and help answer that question?
Yeah, can you repeat the question for the written?
So the question is a very good one and touches on why is a PhD dissertation different from a monograph book? I mean, why can you not just write your PhD dissertation and then publish it as a book?
Or as a monograph.
As a monograph, yeah. I'd like, maybe Laura or Rachel first. Would you like to answer that based on your experiences?
Yes, I'm not sure this will be very eloquent. I think because you write the PhD, you're still really trying to figure out what the heck you're doing, also while you're writing the PhD. Whereas the monograph, at least for me, is new ideas plus some of the PhD ideas, but it's much more polished and it's written for a different audience, which I think is maybe the key thing of the difference between a PhD and when you write a monograph that is going to be published with a publisher, is that you know your audience will be much wider, whereas a PhD is a smaller audience. But I think maybe the question that you're...
Write your PhD for a wide audience, even if only 3 people see it.
So the question again was, can you not write your PhD for a wider audience?
I mean, you can if you're that forward thinking, and some people are very good at writing a PhD that they can just then take, and it is in book form essentially. But that doesn't always suit everyone's PhD topic when you start your PhD, but it is possible.
Part of it, I think, is your dissertation advisor has certain criteria for you. And one of those criteria is proving that you've read everything on this topic, basically, that exists before you started writing. So there's always this huge literature review element of your PhD, which almost always gets jettisoned in the monograph. So there are big chunks of things that are no longer interesting.
I think you can keep the references, but not the discussion of this person did this, and then this person came along and did this, and you basically just dump that all into a big footnote rather than whatever.
And I think also the audience for your PhD dissertation can be extremely specialized. I mean, most of us work with a PhD advisor that is bang on, right in the center of what it is we're doing. That's why we're working with that person. A broader audience is not going to know the backstory of all the things that you have already absorbed, that your PhD advisor probably doesn't need for you to rehash. So I think there are two almost opposite things happening. There's the literature review, which is probably not going to show up in a monograph, but maybe in the notes. And there's a broadening of the audience. So you need to be able to speak to someone. If you are a 13th century legal historian who works with French fabliaux, you need to be able to speak to someone who's an Anglo-Saxon historian that works with, something else. So I think those two elements, if you can capture that in your dissertation and your advisor will let you, that's fantastic, though.
It's worth trying.
Oh, yeah.
No, I would agree. I think the thing is, fundamentally, they're two different things for two different audiences. And I think a PhD, yes, you do have a lot of box ticking in there. But if you're studying something, it's pretty much expected you're going to give an exhaustive account of every single example of this one thing. And I think as well, it's often a different writing style. I mean, PhDs, I think there's this sense you're often looking over your shoulder while you're writing, and you're sort of quite defensive, and I don't know, my PhD is virtually written in the subjunctive. One could perhaps argue that, we might maybe assume that, because I didn't want to pin my colours to the mast and actually say, this is what I think. But I think a book, is going to be read by so many more people, and it's got to go out into the world and sort of represent your ideas, but also by the time you're writing your PhD, you are the expert in this. You've done your time, you've done your doctorate, you've passed your defense. You are the expert, and you have to be able to own those ideas and be far more positive and concrete about it. So, I think the thing about a PhD, the best advice I was ever given during my own PhD was, a PhD is a passport. It's got to get you across the border. If it's dog-eared and tatty around the edges, nobody cares. Once you've done it, and you've got doctorate. You've got a doctor on your CV. But a book, it is the final polished product. It's what's going to get you on the job market. It's what's going to be read far more broadly. It's what's going to be picked up by reviews. So I think they do honestly have to be treated as two different products. And I did a really interesting discussion, sort of a round table like this, a few months back at an archaeology conference. And one of the people on the panel was supervising PhDs, and he said, I actively tell my students not to try and write a monograph, because he said then it's not a good PhD thesis, and it's missing the in-depth research and the drilling down into the subject that we expect to see in a PhD. And he said people who try and skip one step and go straight onto the other do not write good PhD theses.
I just have one tiny thing to say to end that. The title of this session, From Dissertation to Book, comes from the title of, funnily enough, a book that you can buy anywhere online for not that much money. It's by William Germano, and it's called From Dissertation to Book, and it's basically a guide on how those processes work, and it starts off with a summary of how a PhD thesis works and how it's different from a book, so it's worth a read. Not everybody recommends it, but my publisher recommended it to me when I was finishing my PhD.
Thanks. And not to belabor the point, Charlie's going to come find the next question. This is the only question I feel remotely qualified to answer, because the best advice that was ever given to me while I am working on my PhD is that your PhD is a piece of paper that you are submitting for a degree. It is a training exercise, and it is not you writing a book. And that has taken a lot of the pressure off of me writing my PhD. I am submitting this piece of paper for a degree. It needs to be good enough for that, but it doesn't need to be anything else.
Quite a lot of our podcast is taken up by us complaining about how hard it is to write stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, Charlie, just okay, yes, just in the back, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you for this session. I'm wondering if we can come back to the costs of publishing. It's very lovely that Rebels is taking over all of the costs, but there are also other publishers out there who don't, who ask for money up front, or I have a contract with a publisher and I'm paying for the copy editing and the images. This is very common in European publishers like that. I think in the US there's different ways of publishing. Is there any experience? Do you have any tips maybe to funding as well?
Okay, so the question was that it's most publishers don't necessarily offer the kind of funding support that Brepols does. Are there any tips on finding funding for covering subvention costs for open access specifically?
Or for copy? You said copy editing and illustrations?
Yeah, so just
and for copying
costs, not necessarily open access, because open access is completely inaccessible to me.
Okay, for general costs, even if you're not publishing open access like copyright and images. Who wants to answer that?
Well, I don't mean to be flippant, but in my experience, if your publisher isn't paying for copy editing, get another publisher. Illustrations are a totally different thing. If you want beautiful color illustrations, or even a whole lot of black and white ones, it's perfectly understandable that they would need some investment there. And your university sometimes has funding for that. There are other entities. I'm speaking for an American context, so it's going to be a different set of entities. But there are entities out there that are non-for-profit entities that are specifically for funding illustrations for your first book. And there are probably more of them over here than there are in the US for medieval stuff. But I know you already have a contract, so that's not a very helpful answer, so I'm sorry. But I think that you should have a publisher that pays for your copy editing. The other thought, though, is if you have to provide copy editing yourself, it might be cheaper for you to do it on your own and then submit a copy edited manuscript to them if they will allow for that. But
do you mean that I'm doing?
Or you can find someone. I mean, there are lots of professional.
That's what I need to do. That's what
But I mean, in terms of funding, I know there are entities that do that for illustrations, but I don't know the answer to the copy editing funding question, so I'm going to let that go.
Rosie, any thoughts?
To be honest, I'm probably not terribly helpful because we do offer that, so it's not something I've ever been asked about. I mean, again, for images, that's something where we can't find copyright for images. We do ask authors to clear copyright for images, and so there often are smaller pots of money around for this sort of thing. Sometimes universities have it, sometimes there are just small funding bodies out there, but unfortunately I'm probably a bit useless because obviously Brepols does take care of all these costs, so I've never had to suggest to anybody how to find the funding for copy editing, so I'm not terribly helpful here. I mean, I know there are like different funding bodies in different countries, so I don't know, whereabouts are you based?
I am based in Germany. The publisher is in France.
Okay, so in Germany, I mean, to be honest, I would be tempted to go back to your university as a starting point and say, is there any funding for this? Do you have any suggestions? Because often, I know at my university there were weird small tracts of money that had been left, and it was for somebody publishing a thesis on this in this particular year and on this particular phase of the moon, and it was like, okay, I qualify, I can get £500, but it was so niche that if I hadn't asked around for it, I wouldn't have known about it. So it's a case of, I would say, it's well worth asking around, but that's obviously not massively helpful for you.
And I would say, I don't know what discipline. Oh, sorry. What discipline you're in? But say you're in history.
I am in no discipline.
No.
But I think I'm also asking, especially about images, because this is a huge problem, I guess, and I am partly in art history, so it's not necessarily a big problem for me, but I guess just generally for publishing art history, you have a lot of images, and those cost a lot of money, and often we are the people who have to pay for it.
Yeah,
Universities do not pay for it.
It's a very real problem getting the money that you need for image rights. I'm going to move us on because I'm afraid I don't think we're able to be as helpful as we would like to be for you, but I think it's worth acknowledging that it's it's a real problem finding the money that you need, and the point is, don't be afraid to ask everybody. Right, we have a question just here in front.
Thank you. So perhaps this question is going to be more specific to a U.S. context, but perhaps it would be beneficial in other country contexts. But I was wondering if there's any sort of advice in terms of timing, when to start looking at publishing your dissertation. Should you wait until after you have a job, or should you start even if you don't have a job lined up? I recently finished my PhD, but I don't have a job lined up for the next year, but I am interested in at least start looking at the possibility of publishing my dissertation. So I was just wondering if there's any advice. Would that affect tenure? I know that's a very US thing, or would it be beneficial to have something at least in the works before even a job?
Do you want to repeat that?
I'm just going to repeat the question. So the question was about when it's a good time to start thinking about publishing your doctoral dissertation and turning it into a monograph. Does having a job affect your timing one way or the other? Right.
So because you're talking about a U.S. context, I'll answer this one. Depending on your subfield and what's happening in the job market, you have to have a publication to get a job, full stop.
Yeah.
It's smarter, in my opinion, to cannibalize your dissertation, to at least get one publication or even more, two, before you get a job. Most universities, except for R1s, are not going to require a monograph from you to get a job, and even R1s don't even do that. What you want to do is produce that monograph while you're in their faculty.
Okay.
You do not want to produce it before you get there, because then you have to do another one.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So you want to make sure when you're in the traces of your new job that you have that monograph to produce for them under their auspices. That doesn't mean not starting it, though, because the beautiful thing about not being employed right now is that you're not teaching right now. And as Charlie will attest, boy oh boy, does that eat up your time, right? So all of us will attest, right? So when the time comes for you to start teaching, your time will evaporate.
Yeah.
Do a lot of groundwork right now. Get it ready as you can, but don't publish it yet.
Okay.
So you might even want to get a contract.
Yeah.
You can do that. Great. But make sure that you're not going to produce it before you actually get a proper job, and then they can have, that counts for your tenure, that counts for their credit, all that good stuff.
So when I was at your career stage, the people who mentored me informally at things like in the pub at Leeds told me, get a contract and then the door opens for jobs. In the UK system, if you don't have a book contract and you don't have a deadline for when that book's going to be finished, you won't even get considered, because there are just so many people applying for jobs. So it's a really easy way to put someone on the no pile if they haven't got a contract for their book. So to get a contract for a book, like we've been saying, you need to do the proposal, you need to write 1, maybe 2 sample chapters depending on where you're working. And as Laura's just said, if you do have the free time to be able to do it because of the circumstances that you're in, you need to try and make use of all that time that you can. Because once you've got the contract, as I'm a good example, maybe a bad example, you don't have to hit that deadline, but it does get you a job which would allow you maybe to actually complete the work to finish that book. If I hadn't had the contract, I wouldn't have my first temporary job, and if I didn't have my first temporary job, I wouldn't have had the time to write the major part of the book. And then if I didn't have my second temporary job, because I'd almost finished my book, then they kind of help each other, and it's a kind of symbiosis.
Can I ask you a question? Do you have any publications already?
Not yet, though.
Okay.
I have some people that I'm talking about in terms of
an article,
publishing articles.
Yeah.
Okay, definitely get that moving first, though, because contract, yes, 100%, but in the U.S. context, you have to have at least an article out there.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes, so we're going to do one more question, unless there's anything particularly pressing.
Could you say something about the typical time frame, like once the contract is in place? I know, of course, you get postponed deadlines and so on, but how long is the author expected to take to produce the final manuscript? And after this final manuscript has been delivered, how long is then the expected time for the publisher to do the rest?
Okay, so the question is, what's the typical time frame both for delivery of the manuscript and then publishing after delivery of the manuscript? Rosie?
I mean, it's a bit, how long's a piece of string, really? I think in terms of deadlines and so on, so we'd usually hope to, so when you're sending your proposal form, I'd hope to have an answer for you from the editorial board within sort of 3-4 weeks. And then we'd invite in the sample chapter, and the review for that we'd hope would take about 6 weeks. But then, of course, it's a bit of a discussion with you. How long do you need? How long do you think you need? And we'll discuss with you the date that goes onto the contract. For the peer review of the full manuscript, we usually say 3 to 4 months, but I will not lie. At the moment, the hardest bit about peer review is finding reviewers. It is really, really difficult to find peer reviewers, and sometimes we're having to ask 7, 8, 9 people before we can get reviewers in place. So sometimes it takes as long to find the peer reviewer as it does to get the report back. And then, of course, you'll need time to work on the manuscript again. So a lot of this is sort of, in negotiation with you. From the moment I get the final manuscript and it's been signed off by the editorial board and it's good to go, through to the moment it goes to print, we're usually looking at 9 to 10 months. So it's sort of very difficult to put a precise figure on it, because a lot depends on how efficient you are and how efficient the peer reviewer is, and sometimes things just align and it goes really smoothly and then it's much faster, but sometimes things take longer. So
I think we should ask Rachel and grill Rachel on this, because you're doing it at the moment. So I know someone who turned their PhD into a book, and they submitted it to the press a year after they finished their PhD, and they basically had no life for that whole year. Incredible achievement. I don't recommend it at all. It wasn't me. For me, from when I finished my PhD to getting the book in my hand, it was 6 years, What about you, Rachel? What's your experience? Because you're doing it, right? In theory, right, if you finish by the end of July, then how long is it since you, what's your time frame?
I submitted my PhD. It will be 3 years or 4 years, I think.
And how long since you signed your contract?
18 months.
18 months.
That's pretty good going.
That's good.
That's good going.
My contract was a year. I had a year.
What?
But I'd done so much already.
Did you?
Because it took me so long to get this thing going.
Did you say that you just wanted? I mean, when you're in negotiations over the contract, does your publisher just come to you and say, how long do you need? And
so my publisher's Boydell. It was Caroline Palmer.
Okay.
So she was very, very familiar with this project for me for a long, long time. And she knew that I'd been working on it for a long time. So she said, how about a year? And I said, yes. Because I needed that deadline so desperately.
Mm-hmm.
I really needed it. So, and I hit it, which was great. But to be perfectly honest, I had been working on this project a long time.
But that's the thing, and that's why I say it's a bit of a negotiation.
It is.
We will say to you, because when you submit your initial proposal form, it usually asks you for a date by when you can have the final manuscript ready. But we will still come back to you at the contract and say, is this the right date to put on the contract? So it is a negotiation, and we don't have it's not one size fits all. It's not like we will give all of our authors a year regardless, because some people are going to come to us and say the manuscript's basically done. And there are some people who are going to come to us and say, well, I've got a sample chapter, but I've still got to write the rest. So it really is it's quite flexible.
Right, I'm going to wrap us up there. Thank you very, very much to our panel, and thank you very, very much to our excellent audience who've been very patient with the recording that has been going on and the technical requirements of that. Thank you very much as well for your questions and for engaging so directly. We hope you found this useful. A reminder that you'll be able to listen back to this episode on the Early Career Researcher podcast, which you can find on Spotify and I think Podbean, but not Apple Podcasts. And,
no, because they charge.
Sorry?
So you don't want to publish with anyone who asks you to charge up front. That's what Apple do, so we don't use Apple Podcasts. Don't
publish with anybody who has... No. But thank you very much again for your time. We hope you'll tune into the podcast and hope you found this useful.
Oh, don't forget, if you don't want your question on the podcast, to come up after.
Come and see it at the end.